You all in this forum for a few minutes. It really is a great thing to see so many familiar faces, and also to see some faces that are not necessarily familiar but are interested in how we can actually bridge some gaps that I believe exist. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. You heard that I was born and raised in Gary, Indiana. Well, for those of you who know anything other than Gary, and that Michael Jackson's from there, and that's usually what I get when I say I'm from Gary, is that Gary, unfortunately, when I was growing up, I'm 41 years old, Gary, when I was growing up, was the murder capital of the world. That doesn't mean he has more killings than anybody else, but what it means for our size, 100,000, approximately 100,000 major city for many years, still making industry. We had more deaths, more murders in Gary per capita than any other city in the country, actually in the world at that time. That was the environment that I grew up in. I grew up in a single-parent household. My father lived on the other side of town. I was raised by my mother primarily. Saw my father every other weekend. He was certainly an influence on my life. But the neighborhood we lived in was one where we used to get our house broken into all the time. I was 7 years old. I was walking to the store one day, and a guy was just robbed the corner store. And as he came out the store, he pointed a silver handgun about a foot from my face and told me to start counting. I'm now 41, I was 7 at the time, I haven't yet stopped counting. That left such an impression on my mind. But that same year, I also saw someone get shot at a parade. It was that environment. And it's funny, when you grow up in that type of environment, you don't realize that other people don't live like that until you move away and see different things and have the opportunity to experience life in different ways. My high school guidance counselor told me that I shouldn't bother going to college because I wouldn't be successful based on where I came from, based on my background, based on how I had done in high school. That it would be a waste of time for me to pursue any type of higher education. Fortunately, my guidance counselor didn't have as much influence over my life as individuals who actually did have some influence on motivating me and encouraging me to move forward and move past what other people's expectations of my life were. Why am I interested in hip-hop? I know that I stand here today with a full beard and gray, and I have a 13-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son, and I attribute some of this hair right here to my daughter a couple weeks ago, and the loss of the hair in the middle, and some stuff happened out in law school. And I stand here today looking very different and also feeling very different than I did at 18, 19 years old. When I was 18 and 19 years old, hip-hop was just coming into a full substance of culture. It started, of course, in about 82, 83 in New York with some individuals who put some rhyming words to some music and started playing at house parties and on the streets, and it was something that a lot of people were attracted to. In Gary, Indiana, and Chicago, hip-hop was music at the time, developing into an atmosphere, developing into an attitude, developing into a culture. And as someone who was growing up in the middle of that, that became part of my family. It became part of what my friends and I absorbed and what we loved and what we appreciated and what we actually allowed to influence our lives in a positive way. I wrote a foreword to a law journal that was talking about the development of hip hop. And I talked about some names that you all may have heard before, Run DMC and LL Cool J, Fab Five. Y'all look at me like, what is he talking about? But these are individuals who used to speak what they lived. They would speak what they saw when they were growing up in their neighborhoods. And it wasn't always kind. And to those who were listening to it, it even seemed a bit violent. It even seemed a bit countercultural. It seemed almost like a movie. It was something that they were watching that someone else was experiencing. But to those of us who were growing up in the middle of it, who heard it, who witnessed it, it was just repeating what we were trying to say because it was a way to communicate. And so it was something that really was part of my fabric growing up. Not just a culture of violence, but just a culture of communicating what we were seeing and what we were experiencing. I was fortunate enough to get out of Gary, Indiana, graduated from high school and attended Hampton University, a historically black college in Southern Virginia, where the hip-hop culture in 1992 and 1993 took a little turn and started to become more music-oriented instead of rhyming-oriented. See, for for some of us who really appreciate the art, there are people who really have very strong skills. They can stand up in front of a crowd and just tell stories, and they can weave these incredible images just from the top of their heads without having to write anything down. You put that to music and you have a record that some people listen to. Then there are others who were more interested in making money from the art. And so they would go and they would sit down, they would write for a long time what they thought would appeal to larger groups of individuals. And then, of course, some of the record labels started to recognize that they could market these things to larger groups. Kind of what, if it leads, unfortunately became more of the norm when it came to the development of hip-hop in the mid-90s. When I came to Cincinnati, 1993, I came here specifically for law school. I learned from my father and others that it really doesn't matter where you end up. What's important is that you never forget where you came from. And so my intention of becoming a lawyer was so that I could have some influence on helping people understand their rights, was to help people protect their rights, and actually to help to encourage others to do what some people told me that it was not possible for me. And so I began my life as a prosecutor and then joined a law firm called Manley Burke, where I studied under Robert Manley, who many of you know is an incredible lawyer, constitutional lawyer, planning lawyer, assisted the city, sued the city quite often as well. In 2001, I was at Manley Burke when Cincinnati had riots. Some people call them riots, some people call them disturbances. I remember being kind of in the middle of what was going on because I was a civil rights lawyer at the time. I was also president of the Black Lawyers Association. And what I had been seeing after I left the prosecutor's office was really the bubbling up of that happening. Why do I say that? There was, as many know, a very conservative culture here in Cincinnati. And it didn't just permeate in the police department, it also permeated in corporations, and it kind of trickled down to just about every aspect of Cincinnati life. And it was very stifling for a lot of people who were trying to express themselves. They felt that they weren't being heard, they felt that they weren't their issues weren't being addressed. And so as these incidents began happening and people were complaining but feeling like no one was listening, the critical incident happened, of course, with Timothy Thomas down in Overrun, where he was running from the police after having a few warrants for traffic cases, and he was, of course, shot and killed. The protest at City Hall sparked about 4 or 5 days of disturbances here in the city. I was at City Hall when the doors were locked and people were hammering their fists on the table demanding answers. People were saying, we want to know why. We don't want to hear excuses, we want answers. They weren't really trying to get answers because people gave answers, that's not what they were looking for. People looking to be heard. 2001, Cincinnati, people were looking to be heard. Now, as president of the Black Lawyers Association, I took it upon myself to kind of address some of the judges about the fact that there were people who felt that they weren't having their needs addressed and were going to be coming before the system. We know that there were curfew violations, many people rounded up. Of course, there were people who were legitimately charged for burning cars, setting fires, and shooting at police, all those types of things. But the bigger issue was the fact that there were studies and there was certainly anecdotal evidence that people were being treated differently on 2 primary bases. Number one, what they look like. There were different levels of treatment based on how people appeared. And 2, there were, and there's evidence, I'll talk about this in just a second, that based on people's socioeconomic status, they were being treated differently. Now in 2000, the year before these riots happened, there was a commission report issued. The Ohio State Bar Association and the Ohio Supreme Court had done a 10-year study of the court system in the state of Ohio. And through this 10-year study, they issued a report where they justified saying, people always say that there's 2 different types of justice, but we have statistical evidence to prove that that is the case. And they started off in this report saying perception is often reality. Therefore, if one or more believe it to be true, then it is absolutely true for those who actually experience it. The And so this report, was called Core of Commission on Racial Fairness. So this core report suggested several ways to address the disparities and the inequities in the system. So I took that report, and as the judges were hearing these cases of people who were arrested on the riots, I sent that report to the judges and said, hey, just be mindful that while your